Rust Hollow had always been a forgotten corner of the Appalachians, a once thriving coal mining town reduced to crumbling buildings, rusted machinery, and a few stubborn families who refused to leave. The mines that had built the town now lay abandoned, their shafts collapsing inward, swallowing darkness that seemed alive. Older residents whispered of accidents that had never been reported, of miners who vanished into the tunnels and were never found. The town itself carried the smell of coal dust, wet earth, and something more sinister, a metallic tense that clung to the air, especially near the mouth of the old mines. Children were warned never to wander near the rusted tracks, never to peer down the shafts, for the ghosts of those miners were said to linger, restless, patient, and unforgiving. Some nights, locals swore you could hear the echoes of their work, pickaxes striking rock, shouts, cries for help, all carried on the wind. But in Rust Hollow, few dared listen, and fewer dared venture near the old mines after sunset. Ethan Braddock, 24, was the son of a miner who had survived a cave-in decades earlier. He had grown up hearing stories of Rust Hollow's lost miners and of strange occurrences at the abandoned shafts. He never believed them, at least not fully, until the summer he returned home after a year in college. He had come back seeking quiet, a reprieve from city life, and perhaps a sense of belonging he'd never found elsewhere. But the stories followed him. One evening, after his father had gone to the local tavern and the town had grown still, Ethan felt a pull toward the old mine entrances. The air carried a chill that didn't match the warm July night, and a low hum vibrated through the earth, almost like the echo of distant machinery. He rationalized it: wind, settling rocks, imagination. But curiosity gnawed at him, relentless, until he found himself standing at the mouth of the largest shaft, staring into a darkness so complete that it seemed to swallow the moonlight entirely. The entrance was framed with rotting timber and rusted iron, warnings ignored by time. As Ethan stepped closer, the hum grew into a low murmur, almost like voices chanting in a language he couldn't understand. His flashlight trembled in his hand. The air smelled of wet coal, rust, and something metallic, warm, and unmistakably alive. The shadows of the collapsed tracks stretched unnaturally from the opening, curling like black fingers reaching for him. He called out softly, "Hello." His voice echoed, swallowed, and a distant response answered, faint and almost human, "Help." He froze. The sound was soft, weak, desperate. Fear pricked at his skin, yet the voice's awe, the echoes called to him, pulling him forward into the darkness. Ethan descended carefully into the first cavern, each step kicking up dust that coated his clothes and stuck to his sweat. The tunnel walls glistened with moisture, rock and coal pressing close from both sides. The hum had become a whisper, hundreds of voices overlapping, a chorus of men and women trapped between life and death, calling, begging, warning. Shadows moved at the edges of his flashlight, indistinct, fluid, defying the logic of solid matter. One figure emerged briefly, hunched, cold-streaked, eyes hollow. It raised a hand as if to reach for him and then vanished. Ethan's heart hammered, but he pressed on, compelled by something he could not name, a combination of fear, curiosity, and a strange need to understand. The air grew colder as he descended further, chilling him to the bone, and with each step, the whispers became louder, layered, impossible to distinguish. "Stay. Come. We are here." The first cavern opened into a vast chamber, the ceiling low and slick with condensation. Rusted carts and broken tools lay scattered, remnants of a world long gone. Ethan paused, breathing heavily, flashlight scanning the walls, and then he saw them. Faint shadows moving along the far wall, too numerous to count. Figures hunched over, crawling, some flickering in and out of sight, like reflections in broken glass. A cold dread settled in his chest. One shadow stepped forward fully, pale, emaciated, eyes black as coal, mouth opening in a silent scream. The whispering coalesced into a chorus. Join us forever. Lost, stay. The cavern felt alive, pulsating, the air thick and almost viscous. Ethan's hands shook. His flashlight beam wavered. He realized then that the stories were true. The lost miners had not simply died, they had become part of the mine itself, bound to it, caught between the living world and some dark, patient entity lurking in the shafts. As he moved deeper, the tunnel narrowed. The voices intensified, following him, surrounding him, climbing into his mind. He stumbled over debris, scraping his knees, lungs burning from exertion and panic. The shadows moved faster now, darting at the edges of his vision, whispering his name, Ethan. Ethan, join us. He tried to turn back, but the tunnel seemed endless, twisting impossibly, every turn looking the same. It was as if the mine had expanded around him, reshaping itself to trap him. The whispers became urgent, almost pleading, and the air vibrated with an unnatural energy pressing against him, tugging at his body, mind, and soul. Panic surged. He screamed for help, but the sound was absorbed by the cavern, returned to him as distorted echoes layered with the murmurs of the lost. Hours, or perhaps minutes passed. Ethan wandered through the twisting tunnels, the shadows ever present, the whispers constant, drawing him forward with promises and threats intertwined. Every time he paused, figures emerged, hunched and skeletal, moving impossibly fast, gliding along walls or crawling across ceilings, their hollow eyes fixed on him. One figure approached directly, extending a hand that seemed to stretch, bend, and writhe unnaturally. He stumbled backward, almost falling into a pit that yawned suddenly in the floor. The whispers intensified. Join. Stay. Forever. Every instinct screamed at him to flee. Yet he felt rooted in place, as if the mine itself held him, tethered him to its darkness. Finally, exhausted and terrified, Ethan found himself in a cavern unlike any before. The ceiling was impossibly high, and in the dim light reflected off damp rock. He could see hundreds of shadows huddled together, swaying in unison. The whispers had coalesced into a cacophony. Lost miners, children, townsfolk, voices layered across decades, all reaching for him, demanding, pleading, accusing. One shadow stepped forward, taller, darker, more solid than the others. Its hollow eyes bore into him, its mouth stretching impossibly wide as it emitted a sound that was both a scream and a song, reverberating inside Ethan's chest. He fell to his knees, clutching his head, vision swimming. And then the shadow began to advance, slowly, deliberately, gliding across the cavern floor. The voices layering higher, pressing into his mind. Ethan's survival instincts kicked in. He scrambled, crawling over rock and debris, trying to find the shaft he had entered. The tunnel seemed to shift with each step, the mine reshaping itself, leading him deeper into darkness even as he ran upward. The whispers followed, louder than ever. Ethan, stay, never leave. Join us. He reached a break in the tunnel, a sliver of faint daylight sunlight breaking through the entrance far above. Hope surged, adrenaline flooding his veins. He clambered upward, hands scraping rock and timber, the shadows stretching toward him, reaching, whispering, screaming. One long, cold hand brushed his shoulder as he passed, and he screamed, spinning forward, finally emerging into the open air. He fell to the dirt road outside the mine, gasping, soaked in sweat, covered in mud, trembling from head to toe. The sun had risen fully now, filtering through the trees and scattering the mist. The shadows were gone. The whispers ceased. Yet Ethan knew with a bone-deep certainty that they had not abandoned him. The lost miners of Rust Hollow were patient, eternal. The mine had claimed him in a way that could never be fully undone. He staggered to his car, driving away without looking back, heart hammering, the metallic scent still clinging to his clothes. In the following days, life returned to a semblance of normalcy. But the forest, the mine, and the lost voices never left him. Every creaking floorboard sounded like distant machinery. Every shadow in the corner of a room seemed alive, moving. Water running in sinks and streams sounded like whispers, like pickaxes striking stone. The presence of the mine and the lost miners clung to him, subtle at first, growing stronger. And at night, when sleep came, it brought visions of black, twisting tunnels, shadows with hollow eyes, and whispers that promised a return. Ethan, come back, join us, forever. Years later, long after he had moved far from Rust Hollow, Ethan could still hear the faint echoes of the lost miners in his dreams. The whispers never stopped, and he understood, with dread certainty, that Rust Hollow had marked him as it had marked others for generations. No distance, no time could sever the tie. The mine was patient, eternal, waiting for the next curious soul who might wander too close, and the shadows would call, as they always did, join us. Stay forever. Black Pine Hollow was the kind of place that the older folk in the mountains spoke of only in hushed tones, as if saying its name too loudly could awaken the shadows that dwelled there. Nestled deep between ridges, it was a narrow valley dominated by thick pine forests, steep slopes, and a creek that wound like a silver thread through the darkness. Locals swore the woods themselves were alive, not in the way trees breathe or sway, but in a way older, darker, and infinitely patient. They said if you entered after sunset, the woods would watch, the branches bending unnaturally, shadows shifting, whispering voices carried on the wind. Most dismissed the tales as superstition, stories meant to keep children from wandering too far. But every so often, someone vanished, and the stories took on a chilling weight of truth. Sometimes, in the dead of night, you could hear the faintest scream drifting through the hollow, high-pitched and desperate, echoing against the hills a sound no living creature could produce. The locals called it the Screaming Woods, and anyone who had grown up in Black Pine Hollow learned to respect it. Jackson Reeve, 23, had always been drawn to the edge of fear. Raised in a nearby town, he'd spent his youth hiking the ridges and exploring abandoned structures with his friends, seeking thrills that left the others terrified and him exhilarated. But Black Pine Hollow was different. There was an unease to the place, a palpable sense of wrongness that clung to the air. When Jackson first heard the stories, he was skeptical, but after meeting local men who'd survived later night excursions and emerged pale, silent, their eyes haunted. He began to sense that something waited in those woods, something patient, deliberate, and hungry. The allure was irresistible. He decided to spend a weekend alone in Black Pine Hollow, intent on documenting the forest, its legends, and, if he was lucky, capturing proof of the whispered horrors on camera. He packed supplies, a tent, food, water, his camera, and a flashlight. Friends warned him, shaking their heads, telling him to stay away, but the warnings only fanned the thrill in his chest. He wanted to see it for himself. Jackson arrived late Friday afternoon. The road to the hollow was narrow, overgrown, and barely passable by car. The shadows of the towering pines stretched long as the sun fell, and a mist began to rise from the creek, curling over roots and fallen logs. The hollow was silent, at first, too silent. Even the cicadas seemed absent, as though the forest itself held its breath. He parked near a small clearing where the creek bent sharply, the forest pressing close around him. The first thing he noticed was the smell: damp earth, decaying pine needles, and something faintly metallic that made his stomach churn. It was not unpleasant, exactly, but it carried the weight of something ancient and patient. He set up his tent, snapped a few photos of the forest, and waited for night to fall. The sun disappeared behind the ridges quickly, leaving the hollow in near darkness, and with the darkness came the first faint whispers. They were soft, curling, in the wind like smoke, barely audible at first. Jackson, Jackson, he froze, heart pounding. No one else was around. Only the forest, silent and oppressive, towering above him. He shook his head, telling himself it was the wind. He tried to settle in his tent, but the whispers persisted, circling, shifting, impossible to pinpoint. By midnight, the forest had transformed. The mist thickened into a rolling, ghostly fog, clinging to the pines, crawling along the forest floor. Every step Jackson took outside his tent seemed to echo endlessly. Then he heard a scream, high-pitched, sharp, and utterly human. It pierced the fog like a blade, reverberating off the ridges. He froze, flashlight shaking in his hands, listening. It came again, closer this time, layered with other sounds. Footsteps, twigs snapping, rustling in the brush. Shadows moved at the edge of his vision, indistinct, black forms shifting between the pines. The forest seemed alive, breathing, reaching. He realized with growing terror that the stories were not superstition. Something was in the woods, patient, ancient, watching, and it knew he was there. He wanted to run, but the forest had changed. Paths he had memorized in daylight twisted impossibly, roots and fallen logs blocking routes that had been clear hours before. Every direction looked the same, dense and black, the fog curling like fingers over his boots. The whispers grew louder. Now, inside his skull as well as outside, come to us, stay, forever. Jackson stumbled forward, camera swinging, flashlight beam cutting through the fog. Shapes moved in the mist. Figures crouched low, limbs bent unnaturally, heads tilting at impossible angles. Eyes glinted in the weak moonlight, black, hollow, reflecting nothing. He tried to call out, to tell himself it was his imagination, but no sound left his lips. The forest swallowed his voice, as if it were never there. Then came the screams again, a chorus of agony and pleading, layered with laughter so high-pitched it pierced his skull. He fell to his knees, pressed his hands to his ears, but the sound was not just auditory, was physical, vibrating through his bones, resonating in his chest, demanding attention. Something waited in the fog. Something patient, ancient, and hungry. And it was drawing him in. He remembered the creek, the narrow bend near his tent, and he ran toward it, hoping to find familiarity. The mist thickened, branches clawing at his clothes, roots tripping him. When he reached the water, the reflection of the moon was fractured, distorted, and for a brief moment he saw them figures standing along the bank, pale, elongated, faces twisted, mouths opening in silent screams. The whispering rose to a roar, "Join us, stay, never leave." One of the figures stepped closer, moving with a fluidity no human could manage. Its eyes were deep pits of black, and it grinned impossibly wide. Jackson stumbled backward into the creek, cold water soaking him instantly. The figures moved with him, hovering over the water, shadows reflected but distorted, multiplied. The screams layered upon one another, and the forest seemed to pulse around him, alive and malevolent. Panic overwhelmed reason. He scrambled from the water, running blindly into the fog, guided only by instinct, but every direction led him deeper, twisting the hollow until it became impossible to tell up from down, left from right. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes. Time was meaningless in the forest. Jackson ran until his lungs burned, until his legs ached, until the screams became whispers again, circling him, beckoning, calling. He fell multiple times, each time clawing, through roots and mud, fear tightening his chest like a vice. Every time he looked back, he glimpsed shapes, tall, thin, impossibly black, gliding through the mist, surrounding him in concentric rings. One whispered in a child's voice, "Don't leave, stay with us." He vomited, heart hammering, and forced himself forward. He found a narrow clearing and collapsed behind a fallen log, gasping, listening. The fog shifted around him. Shapes moved just at the edges, teasing, threatening, vanishing whenever he turned fully toward them. He realized then that the forest was not just alive, it was aware. It had memory, it had patience, and it would not release him willingly. Dawn finally broke, pale and cold, filtering through the trees. The mist thinned slightly, the shadows receded. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Jackson could see the creek clearly. The figures were gone. The forest seemed calm, deceptively so. He stumbled toward his tent, hoping to salvage his gear and escape. But when he reached the clearing, the tent was gone, leaving only disturbed pine needles and footprints he did not recognize. Panic returned. The path to the road had vanished. The forest was twisted, unrecognizable. He walked blindly, calling for help, but the hollow swallowed his voice. The whispers returned, soft, patient, coaxing, "Stay, forever." By late morning, exhausted, covered in mud and scratches, Jackson finally emerged from the trees near a familiar ridge. The sun shone weakly, and the forest seemed ordinary again. Birds chirped, a creek babbled, yet he could not shake the feeling that something followed him, watching, patient, waiting for night to fall again. He left Black Pine Hollow that day, vowing never to return, driving straight to his hometown without stopping. But the forest left its mark. That night, in his own apartment, he awoke to a faint whisper, carried on the wind through the open window. "Jackson, come back." He jumped from the bed, heart hammering, flashlight trembling in his hands. The apartment was empty, quiet. The shadows in the corners stretched just slightly too long, and for a brief moment he swore he saw figures moving behind the walls, just at the edge of vision. Over the following weeks, Jackson's life unraveled. Sleep became impossible. Every night the whispering returned, sometimes soft, sometimes roaring inside his skull. He avoided forests, woods, even city parks. Every creak, every shadow, every hint of mist brought it back. The feeling of being watched, hunted, drawn. The hollow had marked him, tethered him to its patient, ancient hunger. And Jackson knew the truth as clear as the screams he would hear in his dreams. The screaming woods of Black Pine Hollow do not forget. They do not forgive. They wait for the next curious soul, patient, unrelenting, calling in whispers that twist into screams, promising a welcome that is never meant to be refused. And sometimes, when the wind is right, if you drive past the ridge, just as dusk falls, you can hear it soft at first, then louder, 1,000 voices carried on the air. Come, stay, forever. Hollow Creek was not marked on most maps. The winding dirt road leading to it split off from Highway 321, twisting through dense forests so old that sunlight barely penetrated the canopy, leaving the forest floor in perpetual gloom even at midday. At the very end of that road sat a small, abandoned cabin, weathered gray from decades of rain and wind, its shingles curling like old parchment, the chimney leaning precariously to one side. Locals avoided it, crossing themselves when they passed, and muttering about disappearances and screams carried on the wind. Some said it had belonged to a recluse who vanished in the 1950s, leaving behind nothing but the cabin, a few rusted tools, and a cellar that smelled of earth and decay. Others said Hollow Creek itself was cursed, the creek water poisoned by grief and tragedy, carrying whispers of the dead down through the hollow. But the stories that really lingered were those told quietly in town about people who had stayed the night in the cabin and never come back quite the same. Alex Carter had always been drawn to places like that, the ones other people avoided. 22 years old, restless, and working as a photographer for a small travel magazine. He had grown up in eastern Tennessee, but spent most of his adult life chasing stories and photographing abandoned buildings across the region when he heard about Hollow Creek Cabin from an elderly gas station attendant in Elkmont. He felt that familiar surge of curiosity that had gotten him into trouble more than once. "Don't go there at night," the man warned, voice trembling. "I don't care who you are. Don't go." Alex smiled politely, nodding. But that warning only strengthened his resolve. The allure of the unknown had always been stronger than fear. That Friday evening, with the sun dipping behind the ridges and the cicadas beginning their evening song, he packed his camera gear, a flashlight, a sleeping bag, and a small pack of supplies, determined to document the cabin and stay through the night. The drive up the hollow was narrow and winding, the trees pressing close on either side like dark sentinels. By the time Alex reached the last bend, the forest had grown almost silent, the only sound the crunch of his tires on gravel. The cabin appeared suddenly, half hidden by overgrown brush and low-hanging pines. He parked, noting how the mist rising off the creek curled through the hollow like a living thing, drifting across the roof and disappearing among the trees. The air smelled damp, of rotting leaves and moss, and a chill crawled up his spine despite the warm summer evening. As he stepped out of the car, the first thing he noticed was the cabin door slightly ajar. A swing of the old hinges moaned softly in the evening breeze. "Perfect," he muttered, snapping a few photos as he approached. The porch was covered in pine needles, weathered boards creaking under his weight. Shadows stretched long in the fading light, and when he looked into the darkened interior, he felt it immediately, a presence, heavy and patient. Waiting the first hours were uneventful. Alex set up his camera, taking wide shots of the cabin and creek, inspecting the worn furniture and peeling wallpaper. The floorboards groaned with age, the smell of damp wood and mildew filling the air. It was as if the cabin itself was breathing, settling deeper into the earth with each creak. He found remnants of past occupants, a chipped coffee mug, a threadbare chair, a child's drawing pinned to the wall with faded thumbtacks. The drawing was simple, scribbled in crayon, a small family, smiling, but the faces were crudely distorted, eyes black and staring. He shivered, dismissing it as the work of a previous explorer, maybe the recluse's own child. Night fell quickly in Hollow Creek. By 9 p.m., darkness had wrapped the cabin in a velvet suffocating enough to make the flashlight seem inadequate. He set up his sleeping bag in the main room and started a small fire in the hearth, the crackling flames painting the walls in flickering gold. That's when the whispers began. Soft at first, barely audible over the wind outside, the whispers seemed to drift from the walls themselves, curling around the cabin like smoke. Alex, 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 come. He froze, gripping his flashlight. Hello. His voice echoed through the empty cabin. Silence, but then another whisper. Don't stay, don't sleep. Panic set in, but he reminded himself it was probably the wind. Pine needles scraping against the siding, or echoes from the creek. He decided to record, hoping to capture some proof. Hours passed, and the whispers returned, louder, more insistent. Sometimes they came from the cellar, a low, guttural hum that vibrated through the floorboards. Other times they seemed to circle, the room brushing against his ears like icy fingers. The temperature dropped, a creeping frost settling in the corners, and Alex noticed his breath condensing in the dim firelight. He tried to shake it off, focusing on his camera, reviewing the shots. Nothing unusual showed up in the photos, though the feeling of being watched never left him. By midnight, the cabin had transformed. Shadows pooled in the corners, stretching unnaturally across the floor. Every creak, every groan of the wood sounded deliberate, as though the house itself were alive, breathing, observing. Then the whispering changed, layering into voices, male, female, child screaming and pleading all at once. Get out, leave, your hours. Alex's stomach knotted, a cold sweat soaking his back. The floor beneath him vibrated, low at first, then growing in intensity until it felt like the cabin itself was trembling. He grabbed his flashlight and ran to the door, yanking it open. The porch was empty, but the mist had thickened into a rolling fog that swallowed everything beyond the steps. And in that fog, he saw them, shapes tall thin, impossibly black silhouettes, moving just at the edge of visibility, surrounding the cabin. No faces, no features, only darkness stretching toward him. Alex's instinct screamed to flee, but the forest behind the cabin had shifted. What had been familiar path was now tangled with trees and shadows that seemed alive. He tried to retreat to the car, but every step forward brought him deeper into the mist, disoriented. The whispers rose again, circling him. Stay, forever. Don't leave. They came from everywhere, inside his head as well as outside, pressing into his skull, pulling at his thoughts. He stumbled, falling onto the damp ground, scraping his hands and knees. When he looked up, the cabin door was wide open again, though he had never touched it, and in the doorway, a single figure appeared, small, hunched, its eyes deep, empty sockets, mouth a black hollow. It beckoned. Alex scrambled backward, tripping over roots and stones, lungs burning. The figure followed, gliding across the mist like it had no weight. More shapes emerged from the fog, their blackness absolute, stretching impossibly tall, surrounding him in a circle of shadows. He screamed. The whispers pierced his mind. Join us. Stay. Never leave. Hours or what felt like hours passed as he ran blindly, crashing through the brush, over fallen logs, down toward the creek. The figures did not chase in the traditional sense. They merely hovered, advancing only when he stopped, their whispers growing louder, more insistent, vibrating in his chest. He reached the creek, its dark waters churning unnaturally. The cabin was still visible through the fog, and in the flickering moonlight, he could see the figures lining the edge of the clearing, motionless, silent, their empty eyes fixed on him. One small voice, a child's, whispered, "Don't leave. We need you." Alex felt his knees buckle, heart hammering in terror and exhaustion. He wanted to run. He wanted to scream. But something rooted him in place. A compulsion, a pull, stronger than reason, telling him to step into the water, to join them, to answer the call. His breath came in ragged gasps, his hands trembling. At that moment, lightning forked across the sky, illuminating the cabin, the mist, the creek. For a brief second, the figures froze in place, their forms flickering as if they existed between two realities. Alex seized the moment. With every ounce of strength left, he turned and sprinted away from the creek, through the mist, blindly following what he hoped was the path back to his car. Behind him, the whispers exploded into a crescendo, shrieking his name, pleading, screaming, crying. He ran until the fog thinned, until the forest's edge opened into the familiar gravel road. He never stopped running until he reached the highway, his car, his escape. Breath ragged, body trembling, he drove straight through the night, refusing to glance at the mist-laden hollow disappearing behind him. The following weeks, Alex could not shake the experience. His camera, though intact, contained nothing unusual, only photos of mossy floorboards, broken furniture, and the cabin's creaking frame. But in every shadow he saw moving shapes. Every creek he passed sounded like the low moan of Hollow Creek. In the corners of his apartment, he felt unseen eyes watching, and at night the whispers returned. Faint at first, then louder. "Alex, Alex, come." He could not escape them, and he began to understand what the locals had meant. Hollow Creek Cabin did not merely exist as a place. It existed as a presence, a tether between the living and the shadows, a trap for curiosity, a snare for souls. Those who enter are never truly free. Even when they leave, the cabin follows them. It whispers, it waits, it remembers. Years later, long after Alex had moved to a city far from the Appalachians, he would wake in the dead of night to the sound of soft footsteps on old wooden floors, cold air brushing his neck, and the faint smell of wet pine and earth. Pine Hollow was the kind of backwoods town that the rest of Appalachia whispered about, but rarely visited. Tucked between two steep ridges, the hollow earned its name from the dense thickets of pine that choked the slopes and the narrow creek that cut through it. Dark and swift, winding under fallen logs and rotting bridges. Of all the places in Pine Hollow, the oldest and most dreaded was the Devil's Bridge, a crude stone crossing spanning the creek, built long before anyone could remember. The townsfolk said it had been constructed by a man desperate to save his soul from the devil. and that he had made a bargain with forces far darker than any preacher dared name aloud. The bridge had stood for nearly 2 centuries, weathered and worn, its stones slick with moss and ice in winter, rotting underfoot in spring, yet it never fell. And yet, everyone who grew up in Pine Hollow knew one thing. You never crossed the bridge at night. No one, not for any reason. Those who did well, most of them were never seen again. Jacob Harlow, a 20-year-old who had grown up in Pine Hollow but recently moved back after failing to settle in the city, had always heard the stories. He had dismissed them at first, chalking them up to superstition and local legend, the kind of thing small towns tell to keep curious children from wandering too far. But that was before he found the diary in his late uncle's Attica leather-bound journal, yellowed with age, filled with trembling handwriting and sketches of twisted figures, bridges, and strange symbols carved into stone. The entries spoke of the bridge, of bargains made in desperation, of a presence that waited beneath the arches of the creek, patient and cunning. His uncle had warned repeatedly in the journal, "Do not cross the bridge after dark. The devil waits for those who seek to tempt fate." Jacob scoffed, reading by the dusty attic light. Of course, he thought, it's just old paranoia. Folktales. Then he turned the page and found a single line scrawled in blood-red ink. "It is watching you." The warning gnawed at him over the following days. Pine Hollow in daylight seemed ordinary enough children playing on the edges of the creek. Miners walking home with lunch buckets, the scent of pine and coal dust mixing in the warm afternoon air. But at night, the hollow changed. Fog rolled in off the ridges and settled in the lowlands, curling around the trees and the creek like spectral fingers. The bridge itself seemed alive in those moments, slick stones gleaming faintly under the moon, its arch casting a shadow that looked deeper than the creek it spanned. Jacob couldn't stop thinking about it. He told himself he was safe. No one else had been harmed in decades. Surely the stories were just that, stories. But then came the first night of whispers. Faint at first, a rustling through the trees. Voices, maybe, or the wind playing tricks. "Jacob, Jacob." The words seemed to rise from the creek itself, curling into his ears. His pulse quickened. He closed his eyes. When he opened them, he saw something on the bridge, flicker of movement, a shadow, something or someone standing just beyond the stone railing. And then it vanished. The next evening, curiosity overpowered caution. Jacob walked toward the bridge just as the sun dipped behind the ridges, leaving the hollow drenched in twilight. The air grew cold, a damp chill that crept under his shirt and into his bones. Pine needles crackled underfoot as he approached the structure. The creek gurgled beneath, faster than usual, dark water streaked with silver moonlight. As he stepped onto the bridge, he felt it. The temperature dropped, a creeping frost forming along his skin, and the hair on his arms stood rigid. A voice, soft, coaxing, almost musical, rose from the arch of the stone. "Jacob, come closer. We've been waiting." He froze. No one else was there. The voice was distant, yet inside him at once. Fear pressed down, but the pull, the compulsion, was stronger. He couldn't look away from the center of the bridge. The stones beneath his feet felt slippery, unnaturally so, like ice forming over bone. Then the fog thickened. He could barely see his own hands. Shapes moved in the mist. Figures crouched low, silhouettes half hidden behind the railings, all staring at him. No faces were visible, only empty shadows. And the whispering intensified, hundreds of voices layered over one another, all calling his name, coaxing him forward, urging him to step closer to the middle of the bridge. Jacob's mind fought to resist, but the stones seemed to stretch beneath him, the fog thickening into a wall of icy air. He stepped forward, one foot, then another, compelled by something older than reason. And then he saw it, the figure at the center of the bridge. At first, he thought it Humana, tall man in tattered clothing, but as the fog shifted and the moonlight caught its face, Jacob realized it was not human. Its skin shimmered like wet stone, its eyes dark pits that seemed to draw the light from the air, and its mouth stretched impossibly wide in a grin that twisted the edges of reality itself. The figure raised one hand, beckoning him forward, and the stones under Jacob's feet trembled as if alive. The creek below churned, bubbling and hissing, though there was no wind. The whispering became a roar, 1,000 voices screaming and pleading all at once. Come, come to us, join. Forever, he stumbled backward, heart hammering, lungs burning. The bridge itself seemed to shift, growing narrower, stretching longer, the stone arch twisting unnaturally. Jacob fell to his hands and knees, clawing at the moss-covered rocks, trying to escape. Behind him, the mist swirled, and from its depths, he glimpsed dozens of figures emerging, miners, children, townsfolk from long ago, all pale eyes hollow, faces frozen in silent screams. They glided over the stones without sound, hands reaching, fingers curling like vines, mouths opening in silent cries. Jacob scrambled to his feet, running blindly toward the edge of the bridge nearest the town, but each step felt heavier, as if the fog itself was pressing down, dragging him back. The whispers clawed at his mind. Stay, stay with us, forever. He fell to his knees again, tears streaming down his face, and begged aloud, please, let me go. Silence. The fog paused. Then, with a sudden whoosh, the figures vanished. The stone beneath his hands was solid again. The cold lifted. The creek flowed quietly, as if nothing had happened. Jacob lay there for long moments, shaking, gasping, afraid to move, afraid to breathe. When he finally dragged himself off the bridge and back toward town, dawn was just breaking, pale light spilling into the hollow. He ran the rest of the way, never looking back. The next few days passed in silence. Jacob tried to convince himself it had been a hallucination, the fog and exhaustion playing tricks on his mind. But he could not escape the feeling that something followed him, a presence lingering just beyond his vision. Shadows seemed to twist unnaturally in corners. Whispers threaded faintly through the wind, and at night he heard footsteps outside his window, soft, deliberate, circling the house. One evening, while tending to the garden, he saw a flash of movement across the yard. The figure from the bridge tall, twisted, with its impossibly wide grin, stood at the tree line. It did not move, only stared. And then, as if deciding he was not yet ready, it vanished into the fog. Jacob confided in his childhood friend Mary Lou, hoping she might help him rationalize the events. But she listened, face pale, and told him the old stories, that the Devil's Bridge was cursed, built by a man who bargained with forces beyond understanding, that anyone crossing after dark risked being claimed by the bridge, drawn into the fog, and lost forever. She warned him never to return, to stay in town, to avoid the hollow entirely after sundown. But Jacob could not shake the memory, the pull of the bridge, the whispering voices calling his name. He dreamt of the stone underfoot, the fog thick around him, and the figure waiting at the center, beckoning. The dreams grew more vivid with each night. the whispers louder, more insistent. It wasn't just fear now. It was a calling, an irresistible pull toward the bridge, toward the hollow. One moonless night, unable to resist, Jacob returned. He approached the bridge cautiously, heart hammering in his chest. The stones were slick with dew. Mist swirled thickly around the arches, and the creek below churned with unnatural speed. He heard it immediately. A chorus of whispers, hundreds of voices layered over one another, calling, pleading, laughing. The figure appeared again at the center, taller than he remembered, more solid, the grin wider, eyes darker. Jacob froze, paralyzed by the sight. The whispers intensified, now threading into his very thoughts. Come, come to us, forever. He stepped forward despite himself, then stumbled. The stone beneath him shifted, rolling slightly like it had a pulse. He glanced over the edge. The creek was not water, it was black, swirling, infinite. He could hear voices from the depths, clawing up, calling to him, inviting him to join. Panic surged. He turned to run, but the bridge stretched impossibly, the exit receding into the fog. The figure advanced. The whispers screamed in his mind, begging, pleading. Jacob's hands clutched the mossy stones. He screamed, trying to fight the pull, and somehow, against the impossible, he made it to the edge. One final glance at the center, and the figure vanished. The fog dispersed. The creek flowed normally. Silence. The whispering had stopped. Jacob never crossed the Devil's Bridge again. Cedar Run was the kind of place that lived quietly in the shadow of the Appalachian Mountains, a narrow hollow so tightly hugged by ridges that sunlight often only touched it for a few hours at high noon. The town itself consisted of a smattering of weathered houses, a single general store, and a gas station that looked like it hadn't changed since the 1960s. Most residents were coal miners. Loggers or farmers and newcomers were rare. The hollow had always carried a reputation among locals, quiet, unassuming, but strange things always seemed to happen there. Animals vanished, tools moved overnight, and sometimes, if you listened closely while the wind was still, you could hear faint voices drifting along the hollow that didn't belong to anyone alive. They called it Whispering Hollow, though most outside the hollow never knew it by that name. 18-year-old Wyatt Mullins had grown up on Cedar Run Road, the son of a coal miner and a schoolteacher. He had always been drawn to the stories people whispered behind closed doors, tales of men lost in the woods, of strange lights dancing on the ridges, of the hollows, old, dark places. But he never believed them, at least, not fully until the summer after his senior year. That was when the whispering started. It began subtly, as whispers often do, small things in the background of daily life that you convince yourself are imagined. While Wyatt worked on his father's old truck in the garage, tightening bolts and swearing at a seized piston, he heard it, a low, almost imperceptible murmuring coming from the woods behind the house. He paused and turned, wrench still in hand. The forest stood motionless, the pines swaying gently in the midday breeze. And yet he couldn't shake the feeling that the sound had come from deep among the trunks, low, sibilant, almost like teeth scraping together. Wyatt. Wyatt. He spun in a circle, heart hammering. No one was there. Nothing moved. Just the faint whisper echoing against the hillside, leaving a cold tingle along his spine. Shaking it off, he returned to his work, convinced it was the wind passing through the trees. But the whisper would not leave him alone. That night, Wyatt lay awake in the darkened room he had shared with his little brother until he moved into the attic after high school. The windows were open to let in the hot July air, thick with the scent of wet pine and earth. Somewhere beyond the tree line, the murmuring began again, more distinct, threading its way through the hollow like water seeping under a door. Wyatt, come, come. He froze, sheets sticking to his clammy skin, straining his ears. It wasn't calling him angrily. It wasn't urgent. It was inviting, pulling, drawing. He wanted to ignore it, but curiosity gnawed at him. That night, sleep did not come. By the following week, the whispers became harder to dismiss. They followed him in fragments through the day. While helping his father repair a fence, he heard it in the tall grass. Soft syllables rustling like wind through leaves. Come to the hollow. Come to the hollow. He spun around. The road lay empty. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. Nothing else. Yet the hollow itself seemed to shift when the whispers came, the air thickening, the shadows deepening. His father noticed the change in him, a nervous twitch in his eyes, a tremble in his hands, but Wyatt insisted he was fine. It was just the stories, folk tales. That's all. Wyatt had friends in Cedar Run, but none dared wander into the deeper woods around the hollow after dark. No one remembered exactly why, only that something in the trees, something older than the coal mines, had driven children missing in the decades past. He thought about those old rumors, the vanished miners and teenagers, the figures glimpsed moving between shadows. And yet, one humid evening, with the sun fading behind the mountains and the cicadas growing louder in chorus, Wyatt found himself walking toward the edge of the hollow, drawn like a moth to flame. The wind was still, the trees silent, as if holding their breath. A faint glimmer floated between the trunks, a dim light, greenish, flickering. Wyatt froze. Something about it seemed alive, pulsing, beckoning. Then he heard it again. Wyatt. The whisper was soft, distant, yet everywhere at once. Come, find me. His chest constricted. Fear gnawed at his stomach, but the pull, the curiosity, the compulsion was stronger. He ventured further into the hollow. The forest grew dense, the path narrowing until he was forced to crawl over fallen trees and tangled roots. The dim light moved ahead of him, weaving between the shadows like a living thing, always just out of reach. His footsteps made no sound. The forest seemed to absorb them. He called out, voice breaking, "Who's there?" The light stopped. The whispering stopped. Silence pressed down on him. And then, from somewhere just beyond the light, a faint giggle, childish and hollow, drifted through the trees. Wyatt froze. The voice repeated, clearer this time. Wyatt, come find me. Panic surged. He spun to leave, but the forest behind him was no longer the same. The trees had shifted, or maybe the path had changed. Every turn led deeper into shadow, and every direction carried the same dim green glow and whispering voice. Hours, what seemed like hours, passed as Wyatt stumbled through the hollow. The moon rose high, casting pale silver through the fog that had begun to seep into the valley. His water bottle was empty. His knees were raw from crawling over roots and rocks. The voice became clearer, layered, multiple, children, adults, men, women, voices from across time, all threading together into a chorus of whispers calling his name, drawing him onward. He realized, finally, that he was not simply lost. He was being led to something, a presence older than the hollow itself, something that waited patiently in the shadows for anyone who dared follow the call. The air grew colder, heavier, and the greenish light coalesced into a former shape, at first indistinct, then taller, broader, unnervingly human in outline, yet not human at all. It hovered near the roots of a great oak, a twisted trunk with low-hanging branches that scraped the ground. Its features were obscured by the fog, but the glow it emanated painted the hollow in ghostly colors: green, gray, black. Wyatt's throat went dry. The whispers came again, urgent now, desperate. Wyatt, come find me. Come, come. He wanted to turn back, to run, to scream, but his legs would not respond. The forest had him. The hollow had him. The entity stepped forward door. Perhaps it had always been there, and he had only just noticed. Its movements were slow, deliberate, gliding without sound. Wyatt saw the faintest shape of a face, sunken eyes, long fingers curling like the branches of dead trees. It spoke not with words, but with a melody, a chorus of voices echoing inside his skull. Miners, children, women, men, all calling, all desperate. The whispers were no longer in the trees. They were inside him, threading through his mind, climbing into his chest and throat, pressing him to speak, to answer, to join them. Sweat poured down his back. Fear consumed him. He fell to his knees. What do you want? He whispered. The hollow answered voice swelling with 1,000 layers. Find us. Come, join us. And then, for the first time, Wyatt realized he did not hear this voice with his ears alone. He felt it in his bones, his heart, his blood. It had entered him, and it was patient. It could wait for as long as it needed. Hours or perhaps minutes passed. Wyatt's surroundings began to blur. Trees melted into shadow. Fog thickened into impenetrable walls. The green light pulsated, rhythmic, beckoning. Shapes moved just beyond the edge of vision. Small children darting behind trees, adults kneeling silently in the brush. All faces obscured, all eyes empty, all mouths frozen in silent cries. And the whispering continued. Wyatt, find us, join us. He realized then, in that sickening clarity, that this hollow was a trap. The old miners, the children lost over decades, all those who had vanished, they weren't dead. Not exactly. They were claimed by the hollow. They existed between the world of the living and something else entirely. Something older than time. Something that fed on fear, on memory, on the living who wandered too far into the mountains at night. And now he was being claimed, too. Wyatt tried to run, stumbled, fell. The ground beneath him seemed to shift. Roots grabbed at his ankles like hands. Shadows elongated. Faces appeared briefly in the fog pell. Wide-eyed silent hand vanished before he could scream. He crawled through underbrush, pushed past brambles, and finally burst into a small clearing. The green light swirled at the center, a faintly human shape looming within. The whispers crescendoed into a roar of voices, each one crying, pleading, accusing, demanding. Wyatt's knees buckled. The air itself seemed alive, pressing against his chest, filling his lungs with cold, damp despair. He could not move, could not breathe, could not think. All he could hear, all he could feel, was the hollow, reaching for him, calling his name, weaving him into its endless whispering chorus. And then, just as suddenly as it began, everything went quiet. The figure vanished. The fog thinned. The voices faded. Wyatt was alone in the clearing. The night was silent. The stars above burned white and cold. He was alive. But when he tried to run back toward the hollow's edge, he realized he could not find the path. Trees had shifted. The forest had closed in. The hollow had changed. And he understood. He had been marked. The hollow had chosen him. One day it would claim him completely. The whispering would never stop. Not ever. And Cedar Run would remain, quietly, patiently, waiting for the next soul brave or foolish enough to answer its call. Wyatt never returned home that night. Most folks in the deep mountains of eastern Kentucky don't talk much about Coal Road 17, not unless you catch them 3 drinks in. Old memories rattled loose, or unless you happen to be sitting around a fire when the night gets too dark and the wind slips through the trees like something alive. Coal Road 17 had been abandoned for decades, swallowed by vines and erosion, and left to rot after the mine collapse of '83. Back then, the road had thrummed with life miners trudging up at dawn with thermoses and lunch pails, trucks groaning under the weight of coal, wives and children waving from porches as their men disappeared into the black maw of the mountain. But tragedy dries up a place the way drought dries up a creek. When the roof of Mine 17 caved in, 23 men never walked back out, and the government sealed the entrance with concrete slabs as thick as river barges. Everyone in the hollow knew someone who'd died that day. The grief hung over the town of Briar Hollow like a soot cloud, and for months after, strange reports trickled in whispers of voices near the sealed mine, phantom lights drifting down the abandoned coal road, and children laughing in the trees when no children were anywhere nearby. Folks chalked it up to grief, shock, hallucinations. But the elders warned their families, don't go near Coal Road 17. Don't go near them woods at night. Don't listen to the voices, because they knew the mountain keeps what it takes. And sometimes it gives back something that ain't right. When 24-year-old Emily Reimer moved back to Briar Hollow after her mother passed, she didn't expect to stay longer than a few weeks. She'd grown up here, but had spent the last 6 years in Lexington, working in a bookstore and pretending the mountains didn't haunt her dreams. Returning felt like stepping backward in time. The same sagging porches, the same rusted mailboxes leaning like drunks, the same smell of damp earth and coal dust that always clung to the air. Her mother's old house sat at the end of a narrow gravel road, pressed tight against a stretch of thick forest where the trees grew too tall and too close together. On her first night back, as she lay in her childhood bedroom listening to the crickets and the far-off hoot of an owl, she heard something else, something faint, drifting on the wind. A laugh, a child's laugh, light, breathy, playful. But there were no children living on that side of the mountain anymore. Emily froze. The laugh didn't come again, and she eventually convinced herself it was nothing, just the echoes of memory trying to fill the silence her mother left behind. 2 days later, while clearing out the backyard shed, she found her father's old coal helmet, the one with the dented metal brim and the cracked headlamp. He had died long before the '83 collapse, but that helmet felt like a piece of him still humming with life. Emily brushed the dust from it, holding it gently, the way someone might hold a fragile relic. When she set it down, she heard it, again this time unmistakable, the sound of children giggling. Somewhere behind the tree line, her skin prickled. She stepped out of the shed and scanned the woods. The trees stood still, unmoving in the heavy summer air. No breeze, no wildlife, no children, but the sound had been real. She swallowed hard and backed toward the porch. Later that evening, she walked into town to buy groceries at Miller's Market, where Old Man Miller himself stood sorting apples with his thick hands. When she mentioned hearing children nearby, Miller's face drained of color. He didn't look afraid, exactly more like deeply unsettled. The way someone looks when hearing a name they hoped to never hear again. "You stay away from that side of the woods," he muttered, not meeting her eyes. "Ain't no kids up there. Ain't been for years." He didn't elaborate, and Emily didn't push him. But the seed had been planted. That night, as she lay awake listening to the house creak with age, she heard footsteps in the gravel outside, light, quick, running, like children playing tag. Then a soft knock at her window. Just one, then silence. Emily pulled the curtain aside slowly. The yard was dark, moonless, starless, swallowed in shadow. But near the edge of the woods, she thought she saw something pale. A face, small, motionless. Watching, she jerked the curtain shut, heart slamming against her ribs. She barely slept, and when dawn finally crawled over the hills, she went outside with shaking hands. The gravel driveway was covered in tiny footprints, bare child-sized, running in frantic circles, as if a group of kids had been playing just before sunrise. But some prints led straight toward the forest. Others led straight to her window. She felt suddenly cold, despite the thick summer air, determined to understand what was happening. Emily hiked into town later that morning to visit Mrs. Harlan, an elderly woman known for knowing everything about everyone, especially the dead. Mrs. Harlan lived alone in a leaning white farmhouse, her rocking chair positioned permanently on the porch like a throne. When Emily approached with the footprint story, the old woman shut her eyes and exhaled shakily. "Lord have mercy," she whispered. "They ain't been around in years. Not since the last disappearances." Emily's stomach twisted. Disappearances. Mrs. Harlan nodded slowly. 5 kids, all under 10, went missing the year after the mine collapse. Folks searched every inch of Briar Hollow. Sheriff claimed they must have wandered too far into the woods and gotten lost. But the parents, they said they heard their young'uns at night, laughing, calling for them. Sheriff said it was grief. Mrs. Harlan's voice dropped to a trembling whisper. But the mind takes what it wants. And them kids were seen wandering Coal Road 17 long after they'd adored whatever happened to them. Emily felt a shiver run down her spine. "You're telling me the children who disappeared came back?" Mrs. Harlan shook her head sharply. "No, child. What came back just looked like Em. Emily shouldn't have gone near Coal Road 17. She knew that. Everyone knew that. But fear mixed with curiosity is a dangerous brew. And that night, after sundown, she found herself following the gravel path behind her mother's house toward the forest. The air thickened with humidity. Insects fell silent. The deeper she walked, the heavier the woods felt, as though something unseen was watching her from between the trees. When she reached a narrow trail leading toward the old mine road, she hesitated. Then she heard it. Laughter, dozens of tiny giggles, echoing all around her. High, musical, drifting like leaves in the wind. Emily spun in a circle, pulse racing. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. The laughter stopped abruptly. Then footsteps, soft, quick, all around her, like she was being circled. She backed up slowly until her shoulder brushed something rough, a tree trunk. And then, from the shadows, dozens of small shapes stepped forward. At first, she thought they were children, boys and girls, no older than 8 or 9, wearing old-fashioned clothes coated in dirt. Their hair hung in tangled clumps. Their faces were pale, too pale, unnaturally smooth, their eyes black as coal dust. They smiled, but their smiles stretched too wide, too stiff, too doll-like. Emily gasped and stumbled backward. The children giggled in unison, a sound too synchronized, too mechanical. One girl stepped closer, her bare feet silent on the forest floor. Her dress was stained with something dark. "Come play," she whispered, voice soft as snow. Emily shook her head violently. "Stay back." But the children only laughed harder and stepped toward her, surrounding her like a ring. Panic surged through her chest. She darted through the narrowest gap she saw and sprinted down the mountain trail, branches slashing her arms and legs. The children chased after her, not running, but gliding, their feet barely touching the ground, giggles echoing through the night. She didn't stop until she burst into her backyard, lungs burning, legs trembling. She slammed the door behind her and locked it. For hours she sat in the dark living room, too terrified to move. The giggles faded around midnight, but when dawn broke, she found something on her porch that made her blood run cold. Her father's coal helmet, moved from the shed and placed neatly on the top step. Inside it, arranged with careful precision, were small stones, 5 of them, like a message or a threat. Emily knew she had to leave Briar Hollow. But before she left, she needed answers. She walked into town again, to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Woodson had a tired face and a voice that scraped like gravel. When she told him about the children, his expression grew grim. "You should have never gone near that road," he said. "The collapse didn't just kill those men. It opened something. Something old. Something hungry. Those kids disappeared because they followed the voices they heard, the same ones you're hearing now." Emily whispered, "What voices?" Sheriff Woodson leaned forward. "The miners who died asking for help." Emily felt the room spin. "The children weren't killed by whatever's out there," he continued. "They were changed, claimed, bound to it. And they lure others the same way they were lured." His voice cracked. "We lost my nephew that year. Heard his voice outside every night for a month." Emily swallowed hard. "What did you do?" Woodson's eyes glistened. "Stopped listening." Emily didn't say goodbye to anyone. She packed her bags that afternoon, but as she loaded the last suitcase into her car, the wind shifted. Something cold brushed the back of her neck. She turned slowly. 5 small children stood at the edge of the driveway, half hidden by shadow. Pale faces, dark eyes, unmoving, watching. One boy stepped forward. "Don't leave us," he whispered. Emily felt tears sting her eyes. "You're not real," she choked out. The first time 17-year-old Caleb Donegan heard about the Lantern Man. He was sitting on the sagging porch of his grandfather's cabin on Old Boone Ridge, watching the mist slide between the pines like pale, drifting spirits. His grandfather Thomas Donegan, known in the hollow as Old Tom, sat in his rocking chair whittling a stick, a chore he claimed kept his hands from stiffening. The mountains around them glowed a muted green under the fading twilight, and the cicadas had only just begun their nightly rattling chorus. Caleb had grown up hearing stories about the Appalachian, stories about witches, spirits, miners who never left the tunnels, and strange shapes spotted on the tree lines, but none of them lingered in his mind the way his grandfather's voice did that night. "You ever hear of him?" Old Tom asked, pausing mid-whittle, the blade of his pocket knife glinting in the dying light. "The Lantern Man." Caleb shook his head, sipping from the mason jar sweet tea his grandmother had left on the porch for them. "Folks say he walks Boone Ridge on nights like this," Old Tom continued, "when the fog don't know if it's settling or wandering, carries a lantern that burns cold, blue as moonlit ice, blue like the breath of the dead." His grandfather rarely spoke in riddles, but now his voice took on that winding mountain cadence that made even ordinary words sound like prophecy. Caleb tried to laugh it off. At first, ghost stories were nothing new, but the old man's expression was carved from stone, grim and unblinking. "He ain't no ghost," Old Tom said, as if reading Caleb's doubts. "He's something older, something tied to these hills, something that watches." The porch groaned under a shifting breeze, and the woods below seemed to hold their breath. Caleb didn't press him then, but the Lantern Man would not leave his thoughts. Over the next few days, as he helped his grandparents stack wood and clear brush, he noticed the quiet glances his grandmother shot toward the ridge, especially at dusk and the way. His grandfather grew restless as the light drained away. Old Tom would send Caleb inside earlier and earlier, locking the windows with a nervousness that felt out of character for a man who'd hunted black bear in these hills for 60 years. On the third night, Caleb woke to the sound of footsteps on the gravel drive slow, deliberate, crunching like someone walking with heavy boots. He lay in bed listening, lungs stiff with fear. It wasn't unusual for wildlife to wander close to the cabin, but this didn't sound like an animal. It sounded like someone pacing with intention. Curiosity gnawed at him until he gathered enough nerve to pad over to the window and peel the curtain back just an inch. The fog had crept thick and low, hugging the ground, and through it Caleb saw what might have been the faintest glimmer of blue light far down the hill. It flickered once, then vanished. His skin crawled. He let the curtain fall and climbed back under the covers, telling himself it was just his imagination. The next morning, over biscuits and gravy, Caleb mentioned the footsteps. His grandmother froze with her fork halfway to her mouth. His grandfather set his coffee down so hard it sloshed over the rim. "You stay away from that ridge," Old Tom said, voice low. "Ain't safe out there at night." "Not anymore." Caleb opened his mouth to ask why, but his grandmother cut him off with a gentle shake of her head, fear glistening in her eyes. That fear lingered with Caleb all day, tangling itself in every thought as he wandered down the old logging road behind the cabin. The woods were peaceful in daylight, beams of gold sunlight dappling through the canopy. Damp earth thick with the smell of pine and rot butt. Even then Caleb sensed. Watching, he tried to shrug it off, a superstition left over from his grandfather's story, but every snap of a twig felt too intentional. Every gust of wind carried something colder than it should have been. And when he turned to retrace his steps back to the cabin, he noticed something in the dirt he hadn't seen before. Footprints. Not boot prints. Bare, human, and large. Far too large for anyone living on the ridge. The prints were deep, as if the person or thing had been standing still for a long time, letting its weight settle heavily into the soil. The tracks pointed toward the cabin. then away, then vanished where the fog had pooled earlier that morning. A chill worked through Caleb's spine, but rather than turning back, he felt an odd pulsating like morbid curiosity dragging him deeper into the trees. He followed the direction the prince pointed, moving slowly, heart beating so hard it thumped in his ears. For a long stretch of forest, there was nothing unusual, until he reached the old mining road. Everyone in the ridge knew to avoid the mining road. If you didn't want to twist an ankle or stumble into a sinkhole. The mines had been shut down in the late 70s after a collapse that killed 9 men. Their bodies never recovered. Locals said the tunnels were cursed. Caleb had heard those stories since childhood. But now, standing at the edge of that narrow dirt path, he felt the same cold light he'd glimpsed through his window 2 nights earlier shimmer faintly among the trees. It hovered, then drifted, then disappeared again. Caleb held his breath. The forest around him fell silent. No birds, no insects, no wind. Just an unnatural stillness. He started backing away, step by step, but then the unmistakable sound of a lantern handle rattling in the distance froze him in place. It was faint, but clear, metal clinking with each slow swing. The blue glow returned brighter, this time floating between the pines. Caleb's mouth went dry. The light bobbed once, twice. Then a tall, shadowed figure emerged from behind a cluster of spruce trees. Caleb didn't move. Couldn't. The figure stood impossibly still, like a silhouette carved from the night itself. Its lantern burned with that unnatural blue flame, flickering without warmth. Caleb blinked once and the figure vanished. Not stepped into the fog, not walked away, simply vanished. He stumbled backward and ran all the way back to the cabin, lungs burning, legs shaking. When he told his grandfather what he'd seen, old Tom didn't question a single detail. He simply locked the door, pulled the curtain shut tight, and told Caleb the full story. The lantern man, old Tom explained, wasn't born of ghost tales, but of tragedy. In 1978, before the mine closed for good, there was a man named Harlan Vickeria, miner known for taking the longest shifts and carrying the brightest lantern in the pit. He had a wife and daughter living up on Boone Ridge, and he worked tirelessly to keep food on their table. But Harlan developed a habit of going back into the tunnels alone after his shift. Said he heard a little girl crying down there, old Tom murmured. Said it sounded just like his own Lily. He searched for days, convinced someone had been left behind, but no one else ever heard the cries. The others said the tunnels were getting to him, but Harlan never stopped going back, until one night the earth swallowed him. The collapse trapped him alone with his lantern, and by the time rescue crews dug far enough, the chamber he'd been working in was empty. No body, no tools, just a faint smear of blue light glowing on the tunnel wall like cooled fire. The mine shut down shortly after, but that wasn't the end. A week later, old Tom said, folks on the ridge started seeing that blue lantern moving through the fog, and something tall walking with it. Something that weren't quite human anymore. Harlan Vickery, whatever he'd become, was forever roaming the mountain. Lantern in hand, searching for the source of those phantom cries. Caleb tried to sleep that night, but each time he closed his eyes, he saw that blue lantern floating between the trees. Near midnight, he woke to a soft tapping at his window. He froze. The tapping continued slow, steady, deliberate. He sat up, pulse pounding in his throat, and forced himself to look. Something moved behind the curtain. A silhouette, tall, motionless. Caleb's breath hitched. The tapping stopped. Silence filled the room. Then, in the faintest whisper, too soft to be human, a voice breathed, "Help me." Caleb's heart dropped. A child's voice. A girl's voice. He scrambled backward, slamming against the wall. The whisper came again, this time directly in his ear, even though nothing was beside him. "Help me." The temperature in the room plummeted. Frost crept along the window glass. Caleb stumbled out of bed and bolted into the hallway, yelling for his grandfather. Old Tom rushed toward him with a shotgun in hand, face pale as bone. "He's calling to you," Old Tom whispered. "He always calls with the voice of a child. That's how he lures folks out." Caleb felt sick. "Grandpa, why me?" Old Tom swallowed hard. "Because you listened." Over the next few days, the lantern man grew bolder. Caleb glimpsed the blue light every night, sometimes drifting near the tree line, sometimes hovering by the gravel road, sometimes flickering directly outside his window. The child's voice whispered through the cracks of the cabin walls, softly at first, then more desperate, begging for help. Each plea clawed at Caleb's nerves. But what terrified him most wasn't the voice itself, which was how real it sounded. Like someone truly trapped, someone suffering, someone who needed him. Old Tom warned him again and again not to follow it. "He don't want help," the old man said. "He wants company." But the voice wore Caleb down. On the fifth night, during a storm that rolled in like a wounded beast, the whisper wasn't a whisper anymore. It was a scream, high-pitched, panicked, terrified, a little girl wailing for someone to save her. Rain hammered the roof. Wind slammed against the shutters. Lightning flashed bright enough to turn the entire living room white. If you've ever lived in a small Appalachian town, you know every place has a story. A haunted cemetery, a cursed mine, a ghost road where headlights appear behind your car and vanish if you pull over. But in my hometown of Pine, we had none of that. We only had Dry Creek Bridge, and that was enough. The bridge wasn't big or impressive, just a narrow single-lane structure of rusting steel beams and rotting wooden planks. Built sometime in the 1950s, it stretched over an old runoff creek that dried up in the late 80s when the coal plant upstream shut down, leaving nothing but cracked clay, tangled vines, and a few shallow puddles after storms. But people avoided the bridge long before the creek. Dried dot. Nobody wanted to cross it at night. Parents didn't let kids go near it. Teenagers didn't even go there to make out or spray paint their initials. Because of the stories. Because of the whispers. Because of the thing everyone insisted lived under it. They called it the listener. Some said it was a ghost. Others said it was a creature left over from the mines. Others claimed it was something older, something that lived in the mountains, before people came and just moved under the bridge because people feared it. Whatever it was, people swore it always knew when someone was alone, and it always listened. My grandpa used to warn me, if you ever hear whispering under Dry Creek Bridge, don't you answer. Don't say your name. Don't even breathe too hard. 'Cause once that thing knows you, it don't forget. When I was little, I thought he made it up. When I got older, I thought it was a local scare tactic, one of those tales that keep kids out of dangerous areas. But then, in the summer of 2007, the bridge started whispering to me, and I've never been the same. I was 17 and restless, stuck in that in-between year where people call you old enough to work, but too young to leave. My mum worked nights at the diner, my dad drove long haul, and my little sister, Lindsay, spent most evenings glued to cartoons. I often went for walks around dusk just to clear my head. The air tasted different at that hour, cooler, sharper, carrying the scent of pine sap and river mist. Without meaning to, I usually ended up at the old road leading toward Dry Creek Bridge. I never crossed it, but I liked the quiet there. One evening in late July, a storm rolled in earlier than the forecast claimed. Heavy clouds built up over the hills, thunder rolling like something big turning in its sleep. I was halfway home when the first droplets hit. Instead of rushing back, I ducked into the trees near Dry Creek Bridge, thinking I could wait it out under the old oak that leaned over the road. Lightning flashed in the distance. Wind whipped through the branches. The scent of rain filled the air, and then, from under the bridge, I heard it, a whispered dot, soft, barely audible over the rising wind. At first, I thought it was just the storm wind funneled under the old wooden planks, making strange tones like it sometimes does in barns or sheds. But this whisper had rhythm, cadence, shape, a human shape. Ha ha ha. Hey, I froze. The voice was faint, but it wasn't wind. The syllable dragged out unnaturally, like whoever spoke had forgotten how to move their tongue. Another whisper followed. H. Hello. My skin crawled. I stepped backward instinctively. No one should have been under that bridge. The creek bed was too muddy, the space too tight, the area too isolated. And even if someone were hiding, why whisper like that? Is someone there? I called before I could stop myself. The whispering instantly stopped. The wind continued. The rain picked up. But the voice, it went dead silent. That was worse. The silence stretched for several seconds before a different whisper floated up. Sam, my name. I hadn't told it. I hadn't spoken it aloud. My blood turned cold. I backed away faster this time, nearly tripping over a root as thunder cracked overhead. The voice didn't call again, didn't whisper, it just waited. I could feel it, like eyes searching for me from under the planks. When the storm eased, I left walking fast, refusing to look back. That whole night, I kept replaying the moment the whisper said my name. How did it know me? How long had it been listening? But the worst part wasn't the voice knowing my name. It was how familiar it sounded. Like someone trying to speak through water. Like someone far away. Like someone imitating human sounds without fully understanding them. I didn't sleep that night. The next few days, I avoided the bridge. Avoided even thinking about it. But fear has a strange way of pulling you toward the very thing you want to run from. I told myself I needed closure, needed proof I'd imagined it. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe some drifter had taken shelter under the bridge and overheard my name around town before. By the fourth evening, curiosity gnawed at me so hard I decided to go back, just once, just to check. The sun was low when I reached the old road. The world felt quieter than usual, the cicadas strangely absent, the air heavy and still. My footsteps sounded too loud on the gravel. When I approached the bridge, every muscle in my body tensed. Nothing whispered. Nothing moved. The underside looked empty, just shadows and damp dirt. I crouched near the railing, heart pounding. Hello? I called softly. Silence. I leaned closer. Is anyone down there? Still nothing. Relief washed over me so fast, I let out a shaky laugh. Maybe it really had been the wind, or my imagination. The mind plays tricks in storms. But as I turned to leave, I heard a soft, familiar whisper. Sam, my stomach dropped. It dragged my name out longer this time, like someone savoring the syllables. Stop messing with me. I shouted, more afraid than angry. The whisper chuckled. It wasn't human. It wasn't even close. It was the sound of something mimicking laughter, broken, uneven, wet. Then it whispered, come, see. And something moved below. Not a person, not an animal. Something that slithered instead of stepped. I ran. The following nights were torture. Every time I tried to sleep, I heard the whisper in my head. Sometimes faint, sometimes louder, always dragging out my name the same unnatural way. By the third night, I heard it, even when awake, soft whispers brushing past my ear when I was alone in the kitchen, or washing up in the bathroom, or lying in bed staring at the ceiling. My mum noticed how jumpy I'd become. Lindsay said I looked grey and weird, but I couldn't tell them. They'd think I was losing my mind. On the sixth night, it escalated. I was brushing my teeth when I heard a whisper behind me. Close, unmistakable. Look, I whirled around. Toothpaste dripping down my chin. Nothing there, but the bathroom mirror was fogging over, not from steam, but from a cold breath drifting across it. Slowly, a shape formed in the condensation. Not words. Not letters, a symbol. A crude drawing of a bridge, with something underneath it. Something long. Something dark. Something with too many joints and not enough bones. I wiped the mirror. The image vanished, and the whisper returned. Come, back. I didn't sleep at all. The next morning, I found muddy prints on the back porch. Not footprints. Not paw prints. HANDPRINTS. Long, narrow fingers. At least 8 inches each. Stretched across the wood like something had. Crawled across it in the night. I checked all the doors. All the windows. Everything was locked. The whisper that evening wasn't faint. Anymore, it was confident. Demanding, calling from somewhere outside. Come back. I covered my ears, but it didn't help. The voice wasn't coming from outside. It was everywhere. Something had followed me home, and it wanted me back under Dry Creek Bridge. By the 8th night, I realized something else. The whisper never called me during daylight. Only after dusk. Only when the world got quiet. Only when the shadows deepened. It needed the dark. That meant I had one advantage. Daytime was safe. Or safer. So at noon the next day, armed with a flashlight, a thick rope, and my dad's old hunting knife, I walked back to the bridge. I didn't know what I planned to do. Confront it. Banish it. Just see it properly. All I knew was that running hadn't helped. It only made the whisper stronger. The sun was high when I reached the bridge. Dry creek bed looked lifeless, just cracked mud, tangled roots, and a few puddles reflecting the sky. I climbed down the bank slowly, keeping my eyes on the dark space beneath the bridge. The smell hit me first. Damp earth mixed with something sour, like decayed leaves or rotting wood. Then a sound, not a whisper, breathing, slow, deep, wet. Something was under there. I edged closer, crouching low. The underside was darker than it should have been, the shadows too thick, like they were pooling unnaturally. I raised my flashlight and clicked it on. a faint beam cut into the dark. What I saw still haunts me, a shape hunched in the far corner, long limbs folded like a nightmare version of a praying mantis, skin stretched thin and grey over protruding bones, arms too long, fingers tapering into points that sank into the mud. Its torso expanded with each slow breath, ribs jutting sharply, but the worst part was its head, or lack of one. Its face looked like a smooth mound of skin with a wide, lipless mouth that opened and closed, slowly shaping words that weren't meant for human tongues. When the light touched it, the creature froze, every limb stiffened. Then it turned toward me, not by moving its head, but by rotating its entire upper body with a sickening crack. Its mouth opened, and it whispered, "Psalm." I stumbled backward, slipping in the mud. The creature unfolded slowly, deliberately, each limb stretching impossibly long. It dragged itself forward, fingers digging into the ground. "Come back." I scrambled up the bank, panting, slipping on roots as I tried to escape. But the creature didn't lunge. It didn't chase. It simply watched and whispered, "Come back." People in our part of Appalachia don't fear the forest because it's dark. They fear it because sometimes it isn't. Sometimes light shows up where no light has any right to be, drifting low between the trees like something alive, something curious, something looking. 7 miles outside the coal town of Harlow's Bend sits a narrow mountain spine folks call Old Whistler Ridge. The name comes from the wind, or so they say, because it never just blows through those trees. It whistles, long, hollow, mournful sounds like a tune no one ever taught the mountains, yet one they somehow remember. My grandmother used to warn, if the wind whistles after sunset, cover your mirrors and blow out your candles. Something's passing through. I always thought it was superstition, nothing more than a story to keep kids home at night. That changed the winter Avery disappeared. That was before the light showed up. Before I learned why people really stayed away from Old Whistler Ridge. Avery wasn't the adventurous type. He stuck to routines, same seat on the bus, same bench at lunch, same walk home, reliable, predictable. The kind of friend who told you 2 days early if he planned to skip class. So when he didn't come home one night in January, no one thought he ran away. His phone sat charging on the counter. His boots still rested by the back door. The snow outside showed no footprints. It was like he opened the front door, walked into the winter air, and never set foot on the ground again. The whole town searched for him. Volunteers swept the woods. Dogs were brought in from 3 counties. Voices calling his name echoed through the hills for days. But nobody checked Old Whistler Ridge. They didn't need to. Everyone knew what lived up there. Everyone except me. I was 19 then, home from community college for winter break, staying with my mom and working part-time at the lumber yard. Life felt small and heavy, like the mountains were leaning their full weight on me to keep me from leaving again. Avery was the friend who kept me sane, messaging almost every day about school, girls, or whether cafeteria food qualified as food at all. Then his messages stopped. Then he vanished. The silence that followed was too cold to accept. On the 4th night of the search, I grabbed my coat and boots and headed for the woods alone. Avery took evening walks when he was stressed, short ones, nothing far. He liked looking out over the ridgelines when the fog rolled in, the way the peaks rose like islands in a drifting sea. So I followed the old trailhead leading toward Old Whistler Ridge. Snow fell in soft flakes, muffling the world. Trees leaned inward like bony fingers trying to clasp together above the path. Halfway up, I heard it, a faint whistle, long, low, almost melodic. It didn't move with the wind. It didn't rise or fade. It stayed steady, like someone was whistling deep inside the trees. I kept climbing until the ridgetop clearing appeared, a white bowl surrounded by black pines. Then I saw it, the faint glow of light moving on the far side of the clearing. It drifted between the trees like a lantern, slow and strangely beautiful. But when I stepped closer, it darted behind a tree too smoothly, too fluidly. Avery. I called. Is someone there? The light froze, hung in the air. Then it turned toward me, pulsing gently, golden but wrong, like a stretched candle flame. I followed it, though every instinct begged me not to. The deeper I went, the colder it grew. Trees squeezed together so tightly I had to force my shoulders through. The light always stayed just far enough ahead to be unreachable, weaving like it was leading me somewhere. At one point, it floated past a cluster of pines, and I saw the shape beneath it, a tall, thin figure with narrow limbs and slumped shoulders. It didn't disturb the snow. It didn't cast a shadow. It moved like it wasn't fully part of this world. Avery, I shouted. The light dimmed, then brightened again like a blink. The figure paused. Then I heard it, a low, shaky whistle coming from its direction, the same one the ridge was famous for. I stepped back. Branches snapped behind me. I spun, but saw nothing. When I turned again, the figure and the light were gone. Something brushed my shoulder. I flinched, but it wasn't a hand, it was a scarf. Avery's scarf, grey with blue stripes. Frozen solid, snow clinging to it. My stomach dropped. Avery would never come this deep into the ridge, not on his own. Something had brought him, or dragged him. Then I heard it, a soft, weak, muffled voice. Help. It drifted through the trees like breath. It was Avery. I tore through the forest toward the sound, stumbling through snow and scraping against branches. The voice grew louder, desperate. It led me to a dark cave mouth, black as coal dust. Avery, I whispered into the darkness. His voice answered from just inside. I raised my phone's flashlight and found nothing, no footprints, no sign of him. The voice came again, but behind me this time. Help me. I turned in circles. No Avery, no one. Just that voice coming from everywhere. I backed out of the cave only to see the light again, rising between the trees. But this time, it didn't drift away. It ascended 10 feet, then higher. The tall figure stood beneath it, and now it wasn't alone. More lights flickered on between the trees. 3, 5, 7. All rising, all gathering above shapes in the shadows. Thin, bent, silent shapes watching me. A primal fear locked my lungs. These weren't lights. They were lures, like anglerfish bait in a dark ocean. And Avery had followed one. The tallest figure stepped forward. The woods whistled long and mournful. Then, in Avery's perfect voice, it whispered, "Help me." Every light pulsed. The forest brightened and everything went black. I woke on the trail near the ridgehead, covered in snow like I'd been there for hours. My phone was dead. My body felt wrong, like I'd walked in my sleep. When I looked back at the ridge, it was quiet. Search teams found nothing the next day, not the cave, not tracks, nothing. Avery was never found, except for the scarf clenched in my hand. The sheriff said grief confused me. Said I imagined the lights. But some nights, when snow falls softly and the wind whistles through the pines, I see a glow drifting between the trees on old Whistler Ridge. Sometimes it hovers, sometimes it rises 20 feet into the air, and sometimes I hear Avery's voice calling my name from inside it, begging, help me. I never go back up there. People don't fear the dark in Appalachia. They fear the light that calls you by name, the light that leads you away, the light that doesn't want you to leave once you follow. When people talk about eerie places in Appalachia, they always mention the same things: abandoned coal shafts, broken down cabins, old family cemeteries hidden in vines. But no place chilled me the way Black Hollow did. Maybe it was the isolation. Maybe it was what happened there decades ago. Or maybe it was the voice that kept calling my name long after the sun went down. My father used to say, the mountains have a memory, that every tragedy that ever happened in them never really fades. It just sinks into the soil, into the bark of the trees, into the bones of the land. And if you walk deep enough, you might hear those memories whisper back. I didn't believe him. Not until the winter of 1998. I had just turned 17. Old enough to think I knew everything, but young enough to still listen when my father gave me rules. The first rule of our little Appalachian township was simple. Don't go into Black Hollow after dusk. People said the place was cursed. Others claimed the ground was hollow and hungry, swallowing anyone who wandered too deep. But the story most folks whispered quietly, like something might be listening, was about a man named Elias Rourke. Elias worked the coal mines back in the 60s. One night he went in with his crew and never came back. They found his helmet. They found his pickaxe. They found the marks of his boots in the dust where he stood. But him, he was gone like the earth had opened and taken him whole. After that, people started reporting strange things. Footsteps behind them on empty trails. A man's voice calling their name. The feeling of being watched so intensely it made their skin crawl. Kids dared each other to go into the hollow. Adults avoided it. And anyone who lived near it kept their curtains closed after dark. But that winter, my father got injured at the mill, split his leg clean open, so started taking the late shift at the firewood shed to earn some money for the family. Shed sat right at the edge of Black Hollow Dot, just far enough away to feel safe, and just close enough for the woods to breathe on your neck. Every night, I stacked the wood, locked up, and walked home past the old fence that marked the boundary of the hollow. Sometimes the wind through the trees sounded like whispering, but the mountains always whisper. I didn't think much of it, until the night the voice called my name. The moon was thin, the kind of pale sliver that barely lights the road. Cold air pushed through the bare branches overhead, and the forest swayed like a single giant creature breathing in the dark. I had just finished locking the shed when I heard it, Caleb. Soft, drawn out, like somebody speaking from deep underground. I froze. My breath puffed white in the air. The road behind me was empty. The woods ahead were pitch black. I told myself it was the wind. Wind can sound like words if you're tired enough. But then it came again, this time clearer. Caleb. It wasn't a shout. It wasn't even a call. It was a suggestion, like someone gently coaxing me forward. I should have walked away. I should have gone straight home, but I was 17, stupid, curious. I stepped off the road toward the fence separating the township from Black Hollow. The boards were old, splintered, sagging under years of neglect. Beyond them lay a narrow path disappearing into the woods, a path nobody used anymore. I waited, listening. The forest went completely still. Then, Caleb, help me. That's what did it. That tone, that weak, desperate rasp. It sounded human. I took one step closer, then another. The cold air prickled against my skin. Every instinct screamed that something was wrong. But compassion is a dangerous thing in the mountains. It pulls you toward cries in the dark without asking why there's no light behind them. I climbed the fence. The woods swallowed me instantly. The air felt thicker, colder. Every sound, my breath, my footsteps, the crunch of dead leaves echoed as if the trees were leaning in to listen. The voice called again, faint but direct. Down here, down. That made my stomach twist. I followed the sound deeper into the hollow. The path curled between blackened tree trunks, their branches knotted like arthritic fingers clawing at the sky. After a few minutes, I reached an old mine entrance half collapsed, framed by rotting beams. A keep-out sign hung crooked, its letters faded. The voice came again, drifting out of the darkness. Please, help me. My heart hammered. Everyone in town knew this mine. It was Elias Rourke's shaft, closed the night he vanished. And now someone was inside it. I pulled out my flashlight, Chep. Dim, probably not enough for a place like this. Still, I stepped inside. Cold hit me immediately. The kind of cold that doesn't belong to weather. The kind that feels like it's exhaling from the walls. The tunnel stretched far ahead, the ceiling low enough to force a slight hunch. Water dripped somewhere. Every drop echoed like a ticking clock. I called out, "Hello. Are you hurt?" My voice bounced back at me in fragments. Then the reply came, "Closer now, Caleb. This way?" I didn't question how a stranger knew my name. I didn't question why the voice kept its tone steady, patient, almost amused. I should have, but fear and concern tangled together, guiding my steps deeper into the dark. The deeper I went, the stranger things felt. Not just colder though, the temperature dropped fast enough that I could see my breath but heavier. Like the air itself didn't want me moving forward. My light flickered. "Hello." I called again, no answer. Just the sound of something dragging across stone deeper in the tunnel. A shape moved in my peripheral vision. I whipped the light toward it, but there was nothing. Just timber supports, soaked with age. I kept walking until the tunnel opened into a small cavern. That's when I saw them, boot prints, deep in the dust, leading toward the far wall. But they weren't mine, and they weren't fresh. They looked exactly like the ones they'd found back in 1962, the ones belonging to the man who'd vanished. My stomach dropped. Something whispered. Behind me. Not a voice, but a breath. Too close. I spun around. No one was there. The light flickered again. Weaker this time. "Caleb." The voice was right behind me. I turned the light upward instinctively and saw a figure etched in shadow, tall, too tall. Its head almost touched the ceiling. Its limbs were long, bent at wrong angles, like it had learned to walk by watching people, but never quite figured it out. Its face, God, its face was the worst. It wasn't a face at all. Just stretched skin where features should have been, like something had erased everything that made it human. But the voice came from it. Elias Rourke's voice. Help me. It said again as the skin on its face twitched like it was trying to form a mouth. I stumbled back. My flashlight slipped from my hand, clattering onto the stone. The beam spun wildly, briefly lighting the thing's elongated fingers as they reached toward me. Help me. Caleb, it wasn't asking. It was imitating, repeating, like a recording trapped in a dying machine. I turned and ran. The tunnel seemed longer on the way out. Much longer. My footsteps echoed unnaturally, as if they belonged to someone else, following just a little too close, halfway to the entrance. I heard scraping behind me, fast, frantic scraping, like nails dragging across stone. I didn't look. I didn't dare, Caleb. The voice was changing, now losing its shape, becoming a deep, guttural croak. Don't leave me. The air grew colder still. My lungs felt tight. The mine entrance came into view, a faint glow of moonlight silhouetting the doorway. I sprinted toward it. Something grabbed the back of my coat. I fell forward, hitting the ground hard, breath knocked from my lungs. I clawed at the dirt, scrambling toward the light. Behind me, a low rumble echoed through the tunnel like a growl trying to sound human. I kicked back, felt my heel connect with something solid, and surged forward through the opening. I didn't stop running until I reached the fence. Once I crossed it, the grip on my coat vanished. The woods behind me went silent, dead silent. I never told my father what happened. I never told anyone. But some nights, even years later, I'd be stacking wood or taking out the trash, and I'd hear it again. Caleb. Soft, patient, waiting. A year after the incident, the township sealed the mine permanently. On the day the crew went out to board it up, one of the men came back, pale as milk, saying he'd heard scraping on the other side of the gate before they locked it. Another swore he heard someone whisper, "Please." They were joking probably, trying to scare each other. But I knew better. The mountains have memory, and something inside Black Hollow remembered me, still. Does because just last winter over. 20 years after it happened, I found something. Sitting on my porch at dawn, my old flashlight. Same cheap one I dropped in the mine that night, covered in dust, cold as ice, and when I picked it up, I swear I heard that familiar whisper drifting out of the woods. Caleb, this way?